Happiness. 1. Introduction. A. Buddhism is a path of developing happiness. Happiness plays a vital role in Buddhist spiritual practice. It is fair to say that Buddhist practice is inseparable from happiness. The Buddhist teachings describe many names for happiness and classify it into various categories and stages, culminating the supreme happiness. Here are some examples of happiness found in the scriptures. Happiness of consumption, paribhoga sukha, upabhoga sukha. Happiness of material wealth, bhoga sukha. Physical pleasure, kaya sukha, kayika sukha. Mental happiness, citta sukha, cetasika sukha. Sense pleasure, kama sukha. Material happiness, samisa sukha, amisa sukha. Material happiness, niramisa sukha. Seasonal happiness, utu sukha. Happiness resulting from fame, kiti sukha. Happiness of ordinary people, putu jana sukha. Human happiness, manusa sukha. Celestial happiness, deva sukha. Happiness of the multitudes, mahajana sukha. Happiness of the entire world, sabaloka sukha. Sweet or intoxicating happiness, madhura sukha. Wholesome happiness, kusala sukha. Righteous happiness, dhammika sukha. Happiness of spiritual development, bhavana sukha. Frequent or constant happiness, nitya sukha. Happiness in the realm of rebirth, samsara sukha. Happiness of endeavor, yoga sukha. Mundane happiness, lokiya sukha. Transcendent happiness, lokutara sukha. Happiness of the round of rebirth, vata sukha. Happiness of the freedom from rebirth, vata sukha. Coarse pleasure, olarika sukha. Refined happiness, sukhama sukha. Happiness of concentration, samadhi sukha. Happiness of jhana, jhana sukha. Happiness of insight, vipassana sukha. Happiness of awakened beings, ariya sukha. Happiness of unawakened beings, anariya sukha. Happiness of solitude, viveka sukha. Happiness of peace, santi sukha. Happiness of material liberation, vimoka sukha. Happiness of deliverance, vimutti sukha. Happiness of awakening, sambodhi sukha. Supreme happiness, parama sukha. In terms of beginning stages of practice, the Buddha stated that merit is a name for happiness. Merit equals punya, goodness, performing wholesome deeds. In terms of meditation, happiness is an important factor giving rise to concentration samadhi. As confirmed by the Buddha, a happy mind becomes well established in concentration. In the scriptures, happiness is described as the proximate cause, padatana, for concentration. When the mind is highly concentrated and one reaches the state of jhana, happiness, sukha, is one of the jhana factors, jhana naga, present up to the third jhana. Although happiness is technically not a factor of the concentrative attainments, jhana samapatti, higher than the third jhana, these states are nonetheless considered to be a more refined form of happiness. Finally, the highest goal of Buddhism, Nibbana, is described as a form of happiness. The supreme form of happiness, Paramasukha. An important synonym for Nibbana is Nirodha, cessation, which is endowed with three key attributes. 1. The cessation of ignorance, avidya. This is equivalent to the arising of supreme knowledge and vision, jnana dasana, to realization of the truth. 2. The cessation of mental defilement, kilesa, the elimination of mental impurities, the end of any root factors in the mind causing distress for oneself or others. 3. The cessation of suffering, dukkha, the end of suffering, the attainment of supreme happiness. Although this third attribute, the end of suffering, was described to some extent in the chapter on an arahant's mental development, Bhavita Chitta, there are several more aspects to this attribute that need to be considered. Moreover, this highest goal of Buddhism, of awakening Bodhi, or supreme happiness, is to be reached by way of happiness or through a practice comprised of happiness. It is not to be reached by way of suffering or through affliction and torment. In relation to Dhamma practice, the scriptures describe various kinds of happiness, and at the same time they describe both the advantages and the faults of each kind. They also compare each kind of happiness with other kinds, to point out how one is superior to another. This description of the various kinds of happiness and their comparison to each other is a way of urging people to progress in spiritual practice and to develop superior kinds of happiness. Each person has the potential to progress in these various stages of happiness until he or she reaches supreme happiness. This comparison of various kinds of happiness indicates that although lower levels of happiness may have favorable aspects, they are still imperfect. They still have both advantages at sada and disadvantages at dinawa. In order to gain a clear understanding and to progress in Dhamma practice, it is essential to recognize these advantages and disadvantages. In this context, there is a third factor. One must also have a way out, nitsarana, an escape where one is freed from both the advantages and disadvantages. In short, one reaches a superior or more complete state of happiness. One should apply these three principles while focusing on a specific level of happiness, by examining it and determining its pros and cons. If the happiness is still endowed with disadvantages, one then asks whether there is a way out, a way to pass beyond this state of incompleteness, a way to reach freedom and security. When one encounters such a way out, nitsarana, spiritual practice can progress. In sum, Buddhism acknowledges many different levels of happiness and teaches that happiness needs to be cultivated. One can define the entirety of Buddhist practice as this cultivation of happiness. Buddhism is a system of developing happiness, and the development of happiness is given great emphasis in Buddhism. A. Happiness is reached by happiness. It is often overlooked that Buddhism is a religion of happiness. If one encounters such teachings as life is suffering or all is suffering, one may think that Buddhism is permeated by suffering. When people see that the Four Noble Truths begin with dukkha, suffering, or they encounter the Buddha's statement in relation to the Four Noble Truths, both in the past and in the present, I teach only suffering and the end of suffering. Some people may be convinced that Buddhism is a religion pervaded by suffering. People need to be constantly reminded that the Buddha accompanied the teaching of the Four Noble Truths with the four duties, kicca. If one performs these duties incorrectly, then one trips up from the very start. One will not be able to reach the heart of Buddhism, especially in regard to the First Noble Truth. One needs to be as accurate as possible. If it helps, one can memorize the Pali phrase Dukkhaṃ Arya Sacchaṃ Pariññāyaṃ. The noble truth of suffering should be thoroughly understood. Our responsibility in the face of suffering is comprehensive understanding. Suffering is to be thoroughly understood. Suffering is a matter to be taken up and addressed by wisdom. It is not something to be accumulated in order to torment the heart. If one experiences suffering, use wisdom to deal with it and bring it to an end. This is the beginning of the correct path of practice. One can look at the life of the Buddha before he was awakened. He practiced severe austerities and extreme asceticism, which was the custom of renunciants at that time. When he realized that this is a wrong form of practice, he abandoned these austerities and turned to the middle way of practice, Majjhima Patipada, until he reached awakening. This is a brief summary of events. A close examination of this account from the Tipitaka provides a clearer understanding of Buddhism on the whole. In the Bodhirajakumara Sutta, the Buddha recounts how before his enlightenment he had this thought. Happiness cannot be reached by way of happiness, it can only be reached by way of pain. It was for this reason that he went forth into the renunciant way of life. When he went to live with two meditation masters at their hermitages, afterwards he undertook extreme ascetic practices with intensity and ardor, experiencing extreme physical pain, but all in vain. He realized that it is not possible to reach the supreme good by way of self-mortification. Note here his words. The way to awakening must be otherwise. He remembered an event from his childhood when he was sitting quietly alone in the shade of a jambolan tree and had attained the first jhana, distinguished by bliss and joy. He had the insight that this is the path, as confirmed by the words he spoke to himself. Here indeed is the path to awakening. When he was clear in his mind about this issue, he asked himself whether he is afraid of this happiness free from sensual pleasure and free from unwholesome states. This was a way of verifying whether this happiness contains any danger. He answered with confidence that he was without fear. He consequently abandoned the extreme ascetic practices, followed the path of happiness, which is represented by the term middle way, Majjhima Patipada, and finally reached awakening. An important distinction is that many of the religious traditions in India at that time claimed that happiness cannot be reached by way of happiness. It can only be reached by way of pain. Adherents of these traditions thus undertook extreme ascetic practices, tapa. Buddhism, however, teaches that happiness can be reached by way of happiness, and thus encourages practitioners to abandon extreme ascetic practices, which are classified as self-mortification Atta Kila Mata Nu Yoga and is considered a waste of time. The most basic form of happiness is derived by coming into contact with external objects and is dependent on material things, and is thus referred to as sense pleasure, kama sukha. When one has developed and accessed a higher form of happiness, this superior happiness exists in tandem with sense pleasure. Alternatively, one may choose to abandon sense pleasure altogether and only abide in a more refined kind of happiness. These superior forms of happiness prevent the dangers of a dependence on material things. Indeed, they provide a greater degree of independence. One is able to experience happiness without needing to consume things. Note the phrase by the Buddha above: happiness free from sensual pleasure and free from unwholesome states. One progresses in unison with wholesome desire, chanda. A vital factor in this correct practice for promoting independence is wisdom. With wisdom, even if the refined forms of happiness are sustained over a long period of time, they do not overwhelm the mind. One is not intoxicated. One does not forget oneself. True happiness goes hand in hand with freedom, and conversely, true freedom is endowed with happiness. One reason why the birth of Buddhism was so revolutionary, allegedly causing an earthquake and excitement all the way up to the highest Brahma realms, is because it introduced this new perspective and way of life, that happiness can be reached by happiness. The goal of Buddhism, supreme happiness, Paramasukha, is accompanied by wisdom, which frees the mind through understanding. This is genuine, independent, and secure happiness. It need not be searched for, and it is free from a reliance on external things. It remains constant. Wherever one is bright, joyous, and happy. All of us who are aware of this principle of supreme happiness have the opportunity to develop ourselves in order to realize it.